My life flows on in endless song above Earth's lamentation. I hear the real, the far off hymn that hails a new creation.
No storm can shake my inmost heart, while to that rock I'm clinging, since love prevails in heaven and earth. How can I keep from singing?
While all the tempest round me roars, I know the truth it lives
is welcome here. Your ethnic, ancestral, physical, spiritual, emotional, sexual, political self. Leave nothing at the door. Bring your whole self. All of who you are is welcome in this place.
Good morning and welcome to the online worship of the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Montgomery. I'm speaking to you from the ancestral home of the Muskogee Creek people. I would like to invite you into this hour of worship with words from the Unitarian scholar, minister, and prophet, James Luther Adams. I call that church free, which brings individuals into a caring, trusting fellowship that protects and nourishes their integrity and spiritual freedom, that yearns to belong to the church universal. It is open to insight and conscience from every source. It bursts through rigid tradition, giving rise to new and living language, to new and broader fellowship. It is a pilgrim church, a servant church, on an adventure of the Spirit. The goal is the prophethood and priesthood of all believers, the one for the liberty of prophesying, the other for the ministry of healing. It is our practice in each service to speak aloud our congregational covenant. And so I invite you to say it with me at this time. We, the members and friends of the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Montgomery, promise to serve our community with open minds, willing hearts, and helping hands, as we respect one another, honoring that our perceptions may differ, value our differences, working to better understand them in conflict, give joyfully of ourselves, being in harmony with our capabilities, and embrace our connections with each other, nature, the global community, and the great mystery of life. Now, our coordinator of religious education, Roger Burdett, offers us a time for all ages.
Hey, I am the ghost of video yet to come. See, I've already produced the video that you're about to see, but it's way too long for one showing, and I simply don't want to redo it. So I created this persona. I will introduce the video, I will end the video at the correct time, and then we'll have more of today's video on another day. Enjoy. Hey, and welcome to Time for All Ages. Our time today is dedicated to the power of positive thinking. Oh man, Roger, all that pseudoscience, come on, man. I don't think it's pseudoscience. Now, I admit I'm not a doctor or a psychologist or psychiatrist or whoever would be an expert on this topic. I did find an article from hopkinsmedicine.org, which I think is a legit source, and the article is entitled "The Power of Positive Thinking." People with a family history of heart disease who also had a positive outlook were 1/3 less likely to have a heart attack. Obviously, you can look more into that on your own if you wish, but where I'm going is to a nice little story called "The Power of Positivity: The ABCs of a Pandemic." Now that is relevant. By Ruth Malley, I'm not sure about the pronunciation, illustrated by Harry Avera. The preface says, "Meet Orbit, our special mascot." Orbit is a fun-loving planet Earth whose purpose is to spread kindness, love, and hope. And they go on to say, on every page, there will be some orbits hiding, so we will look for those. For example, on the first page of this story, I see Orbit hiding between two of those young people. It's not often that a worldwide pandemic comes along, but when it does, we suddenly find that everything in our lives has changed. As we learn to live in this unusual time, here are some words to remember. A is for appreciate. We appreciate the doctors and the nurses who are working day and night to heal the people who are sick and help everyone stay healthy. B is for breath. We all feel anxious from time to time. Taking a deep breath can help you feel calm. C, corporations. Many corporations are donating money and equipment so that all children can have the opportunity to learn over the internet. D is for drive-by. We celebrate birthdays, anniversaries, weddings, and graduations as we drive by in our cars and beep the horns. I've done that at least once. E is for exercise. No matter what kind of exercise we do, moving around can turn any sad moment into a happier one. F is for face masks. Wearing a face mask is one of the best ways to show you care about others. It keeps everyone safe. Now listen, just because I read these stories doesn't mean I agree with everything. After all, I've been associated with UU for 15 or 20 years and we're very critically minded. I don't necessarily agree with this one, but I appreciate the spirit. G is for governors. The governors of our states are working together to control this unknown virus and keep the people in their states healthy. But please, let's not go with politics for right now. H is for healthy. We fill our bodies with nutritious food so we can be healthy and strong. All right, so I will cut the video off there and we'll have some more later. Have a great week.
Now let us sing.
Sing to the power of the faith within. Sing to the power of the faith within. Lift up your voice, be not afraid. Sing to the power of the faith within. Sing to the power of the hope within. Sing to the power of the hope within. Lift up your voice, be not afraid. Sing to the power of the hope within. Sing to the power of the love within. Sing to the power of the love within. Lift up your voice, be not afraid. Sing to the power of the love within. Sing to the power of the joy within. Sing to the power of the joy within. Lift up your voice, be not afraid. Sing to the power of the joy within.
It is the practice of this congregation to set aside a moment of communal prayer, a time when we lift up and let go the things that we carry with us through the week. These weeks have been full. Personally, I celebrate this week the shift that's coming in our U.S. Supreme Court. At the same time as I mourn the detestable tragedy of the execution of Matthew Greaves on Thursday evening. With the pandemic continuing to rage in our midst, and news emerging every day that seems to point one way and then another, many of us live in confusion, anxiety, and frustration. And so in this time, we hold one another and ourselves in compassion. I invite you to use the screen adjacent to the video and type whatever is on your heart this morning, the joys as well as the sorrows, the celebrations as well as the concerns.
Spirit of life, come to me, sing in my heart all the stirrings of compassion, blow in the wind, rise in the sea, move in the hand, giving life the shape of justice. Roots hold me close, wings set me free. Spirit of life, come to me, come to me. Fuente de amor, ven hacia mí, y al corazón cántale compasión. Sopla al volar, sube la mar, hasta moldear la justicia de la vida. Arraigame, libérame, fuente de amor, ven a mí, ven a mí.
It's still Chalaka, right? The winter festival of Unitarian Universalists, in which we take each of the first 8 weeks of the year to give particular attention to each of our 7 and now 8 principles. We, the member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association, covenant to affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person. Justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. Acceptance of one another and encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations. And of course, number 8, which has not yet been affirmed by the association, but which our own congregation affirmed last summer, journeying toward spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and in our institutions. You know, I did them out of order because I took advantage of the occasion of Martin Luther King's birthday to talk about the eighth principle. So this week we are back to number 4. We covenant to affirm and promote a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. So the fourth principle is appropriate to this day in which we have a guest speaker. This Sunday, we have the opportunity to hear from a retired United Methodist minister and a lifelong Universalist who travels the country talking to people about the power of Universalism. And so I would like to welcome now Kaylin Freestad.
I want to thank you for the invitation to be with you today. It's a great pleasure. As Lynn indicated, my wife Darlene and I travel the country about half time, speaking to churches around the country about Universalism. And I've spoken at more than 240 UU churches across the country. I love UU churches. I love the diversity, the respect for each other. And UUs are ones to readily admit they're not perfect, but they strive to have unity and respect and to affirm diversity. I've learned from my experiences as a minister that many churches tolerate diversity. Some churches don't even tolerate diversity, but I've learned that UUs celebrate diversity. And I think that's one of the great strengths of UU churches, and that's certainly something that I celebrate with all of you. When I served the United Methodist Church in Dallas Center, Iowa, I became acquainted with the UU minister in Des Moines. And when she realized that I believed in Universalism, she invited me to attend a special service that their church is going to be having. It was going to be in the small town of Mitchellville, which is just a few miles east of Des Moines. It's going to be in a church building that originally housed a Universalist congregation. There's not a congregation there anymore, but that church in Des Moines had the tradition at that time of having one service each summer at that originally Universalist church. And so I was happy to accept her invitation to join them for that service. I'll always remember when I walked up the walk in front of that church, over the door it read, Universalist Church. And I thought, I have arrived at home. Universalism has been really important to me for a long time. Because of that, I wrote a book on the subject. And as I said, Darlene and I travel around the country about half time speaking on the subject of Universalism. Today I'm going to be speaking on the subject of the history and the significance of the teaching of Universalism. It is sometimes referred to as universal salvation. So I'd like to offer a definition of salvation that's probably different from what you've heard from other sources. You're probably aware that, at least among fundamentalist or conservative Christians, their definition of salvation would be to accept Jesus as your personal Savior so you can go to heaven when you die. Well, I believe, now granted that definition apparently works for many, many people, but to me it's not a very adequate understanding of salvation. So I've come up with a definition that works for me, and that is salvation is to learn and grow either with or without divine influence so as to experience fullness of life in this life and beyond. And if you don't believe in the divine, or if you don't believe in life after death, you can just leave those parts off the definition. And so to me, the most basic understanding of universalism, or salvation, I should say, the most basic understanding of salvation is to learn and grow so as to experience fullness of life. So in contrast to what a lot of people believe, I reject the idea that a lot of people are going to spend eternity suffering in hell. Instead, I believe that everyone will eventually experience fullness of life or salvation. And for certain individuals, if that doesn't take place in this lifetime, I believe it will take place sometime beyond. During the time of Jesus, it was commonly taught in most of the religions of the day that a lot of people, probably the vast majority of people, would spend eternity suffering in hell. But one exception to that would have been the Zoroastrians. Perhaps you're aware that the Zoroastrian faith was developed in the area of Persia in the 5th and the 6th centuries before the time of Jesus. Now, Persia, of course, is where the current country of Iran is today. Anyway, the Zoroastrians were Universalists. Isn't that wonderful? That is great. Another example would be Jesus, who, in contrast to the conventional thinking of his day, did not teach eternal damnation, but there's many passages in the Bible that tell us that Jesus did teach universalism, that everybody would eventually make it, experience fullness of life. In the environment, though, where the conventional thinking was that a lot of people would spend eternity suffering in hell, it was sometimes difficult to convince people otherwise. And so there were people who became Christians. In other words, they professed to be followers of Jesus, but at the same time, they continued to hold on to the belief of endless suffering of many people beyond death. But there were a lot of the early Christians who believed in universalism. In fact, it seems like it was the majority, probably the vast majority of the early Christians did believe in universalism or universal salvation. Clement and Origen of Alexandria were two more prominent ones who taught universalism. Others included Gregory of Nyssa, Ambrose, Bishop of Milan, and many others as well. As I said, though, there were some followers of Jesus who weren't fully converted. They professed to be followers of Jesus, but at the same time, they continued to hold on to the idea of the endless suffering of many people beyond death. Tertullian, theologian Tertullian, was one example of those people. He became a Christian at age 40, and he held on to his belief of the endless suffering of many people beyond death. In fact, he so relished the idea of people suffering in hell, which is pretty astonishing in itself. But he so relished the idea of people suffering in hell that he said he believed that one of the best things about heaven would be the superb view of the damned frying in hell. Now, doesn't the thought of that just make you feel good all over? Isn't that astonishing that a person who professed to be a follower of Jesus, a follower of the one who taught so much about love and peace and forgiveness and grace and so on, could so relish the idea of so many people suffering excruciating torment in hell? The theologian Augustine was another example of a person who was not fully converted to Christianity, became a Christian at age 32, and he also continued to believe in the eternal damnation of certain people, or a lot of people. But anyway, he was a pretty decent theologian in many respects, and so it's not too surprising that Augustine's theology soon started to become at least somewhat dominant in the church. He lived in the at the end of the 4th century and into the 5th century. So it's not surprising that by the 6th century, there was coming to be quite a controversy over the issue of universalism. In order to resolve this controversy, the Roman Emperor Justinian called a church meeting. It was the 5th General Council in the year 553. Now, does it seem a little strange to you that a Roman emperor would call a church meeting? Well, on the surface, it would seem a little odd, but when you think about it, it makes perfect sense. Because emperors like to control people, that's a given. And people had learned even before then that threatening people with eternal damnation is a foolproof means of controlling them. And you see, if you can convince people that there's a real possibility of spending eternity in hell, then you've got them where you want them. You can get them to do anything you want by threatening them with eternal damnation. The problem is, now that probably sounds familiar to many of you, because churches today, many churches today, still seek to control people by threatening them with eternal damnation. The problem is, the emperor and many of the church leaders were having trouble controlling those free-spirited universalists. They could threaten them with unending hell all they wanted, and they didn't take it seriously. So out of frustration, the emperor allied himself with the hellraisers of the day, the people who advocated the unending suffering of people in hell. And together they pushed through a resolution which abolished the teaching of universalism. Well, it's not surprising that with all of the powers of the church and the state against the teaching of universalism pretty well died out after that, or went dormant, or went underground. And that lasted for a long time, really about 1,000 years. But you can't suppress the truth indefinitely, right? Eventually it'll start bubbling up someplace. And that's what happened about 300 years ago. It really started more than 300 years ago, but it was about 300 years ago when it started to become a strong movement once again. John Wesley, who was the primary organizer and leader of the Methodist movement back in England and back in the 18th century, he had a close association with a group of Christians called the Moravians. Now the Moravians believed in universalism. Hallelujah. Isn't that a wonderful deal? But initially, Wesley didn't agree with them. He argued with them. He thought they were really wrong. But it seems that they eventually wore him down. Wesley eventually came to believe in universalism. And I love to tell United Methodists that John Wesley eventually came to believe in universalism. And that is because in the United Methodist Church, the most conservative people are the ones who are most likely to reject the teaching of universalism. At the same time, they can often be heard to say, let's go back and reestablish the teachings of John Wesley. And I say, yeah, let's do that. Because he eventually came to believe in universalism. The American colonies proved to be a particularly fertile ground for the spread of the teaching of universalism. George de Benneville came over from France in 1741, and he settled in eastern Pennsylvania, and he did quite a bit to spread the teaching of universalism in eastern Pennsylvania and in New Jersey and in Maryland. John Murray came to the American colonies from England in 1770, and he worked closely with the Quakers and the Baptists in spreading the teaching of universalism throughout the American colonies. It was under Murray's leadership that the Universalist Church in America was organized. As was true at the time of the early church, there were many prominent women leaders in this early, or this more recent version of the Universalist Church. Because of that, Olympia Brown was the first woman to be ordained by any denomination when she was ordained in the Universalist Church in 1863. Now, we in the United Methodist Church started ordaining women in 1956. And that's pretty good, considering there's some denominations that don't ordain women even at all. And so I felt really good about the fact that we started ordaining women in 1956, until I learned that the Universalists beat us by almost 100 years when they ordained Olympia Brown in 1863. Hosea Ballou was the most prominent leader in the Universalist Church during his life and ministry. When he died in 1852, the Universalist Church had about 800,000 members. So it was a strong movement, to be sure. The teaching of universalism hasn't been espoused only by Universalists or Unitarians, for that matter, but has been espoused by other leaders and theologians of other denominations as well. For example, back in the 19th century, there was a German theologian named Friedrich Schleiermacher. Now, I usually, when I speak at UU churches, or other churches, I guess for that matter, I will ask how many people have heard of old Friedrich. And so I ask for a show of hands, and usually it's maybe 5% at the most. Sometimes nobody's heard of Friedrich. But Friedrich Schleiermacher, so he's obviously not a well-known theologian, but he was a fine theologian and a strong advocate of universalism. Besides that, I just like to say his name. Friedrich Schleiermacher. I love that name. It just seems that should be the envy of the civilized world to have a name like Friedrich Schleiermacher. Anyway, so I think that's pretty cool. Anyway, in the 20th century, there have been many other prominent leaders and theologians who taught that everyone would eventually experience fullness of life or salvation. Those included Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Karl Barth, Paul Tillich, Leslie Weatherhead, many others as well. So the teaching of Universalism has a long, rich history for more than 500 years following the time of Jesus, and then especially again in the last 300 years as well. So you might wonder, why is this such an important issue for me as a United Methodist minister? Unfortunately, Universalism is not a part of the doctrine of our church. So why is it that I find myself swimming upstream in my denomination? Well, it seems to me that this is really an important issue. I wouldn't be doing this. But it seems to me that the teaching of a God of eternal damnation has prevailed for far too long in most churches and in our society at large, and with devastating consequences. One of the reasons this is important to me is because the teaching of a God of eternal damnation turns many people away from God. Many people know how crazy it is, literally insane it is, the idea of eternal torment. If parents were to torment or to punish their children, to torture their children for a length of time, what would happen to them? We know what happens to parents who do that. They either end up in prison or a mental hospital. And that's what they say God's going to do, torture people forever because they were naughty. I mean, give me a break. That is literally an insane concept, but yet that is embraced by an awful lot of people, a lot of Christians in various denominations. So the teaching of a God of eternal damnation turns many people away from God. Sometimes they become atheists. Now, I need to acknowledge that I've learned a lot about atheism from UUs, and I'm grateful. I've met a lot of wonderful atheists in UU churches. Of course, I've met a lot of wonderful people of a great variety of faiths in UU churches. But I've learned that for some of them, they find atheism to be a thoughtful, responsible, mature way to approach life. And it works for them. For people for whom atheism works, I really don't have a difficulty. But of people in other denominations, when they become atheists, it often is not such a positive thing. And that is because they still have in the back of their mind the possibility of spending eternity in hell in many cases. And if there's no God to rescue them from that plight, then they sometimes conclude that they are doomed. And that can lead to despair and meaninglessness. In a lot of churches, the members attend only at Christmas and Easter. And there's a good reason for that. Christmas and Easter are 2 times of celebration. And on those 2 times of celebration, there's little danger that anybody's going to bring up the idea of that awful teaching of a God of eternal damnation. So it's not because they're too lazy to get up and go to church the rest of the Sundays of the year. It's for self-preservation. They've heard more damnation teaching than they care to hear about, and they're not going to put up with any more. And so they stay away from church except for Christmas and Easter, those 2 times of celebration, when there's little danger anybody's going to talk about a God of eternal damnation. Then there's perhaps pretty close to half the population that doesn't go to church even at Christmas and Easter. I've talked with an awful lot of unchurched people, and they so often bring up the idea of eternal damnation that it obviously is an issue that weighs heavily upon them. And they seem to hope that somebody will agree with them, to tell them that it ain't so, that that's not what God is like. Many people seem to instinctively want to challenge the idea of a monster God who throws people into hell, kicking and screaming against their will to torture them forever because they were naughty. They also seem to reject the idea of a weak and a not very caring God who either doesn't want to save everybody or who is not able to save everybody. And so those 2 understandings of God are not particularly appealing. And because of those 2 understandings of God, there are many people that don't want anything to do with God, and they certainly don't want anything to do with the church either. So many of these disillusioned people are not aware that there are open-minded and progressive churches among United Methodist and Presbyterian and Lutheran and Episcopalian and so on, as well as UU churches. Of course, they are not aware that there are churches that teach love instead of judgment, that teach hope instead of damnation, and they drop out of church altogether. We all want to make the world a better place. And this is what motivates me more than anything else to travel around the country speaking on the subject of universalism. We all want to make the world a better place, but it seems to me that we're not going to have very much success in doing that as long as the teaching of a God of eternal damnation continues to prevail in most churches and in our society at large. And that is because what people believe about God has a powerful and a direct influence on how they live their lives. If they believe that God is judgmental and condemning and cruel, it's very, very easy to justify living that same way themselves. It's like the old song, "One Tin Soldier" goes, "Go ahead and hate your neighbor. Go ahead and cheat a friend. Do it in the name of heaven. You can justify it in the end." Sadly, I see people every day in our own country and around the world who seek to justify evil behavior in the name of heaven, in the name of God. And it's much easier to do that if we believe that God is judgmental and condemning and cruel. On the other hand, if we believe that God is loving and kind and merciful and gracious and patient and so on, then we're much more likely to live according to those standards. I believe that this is of enormous significance. It seems to me that if we're going to change the world for the better, perhaps the most important single thing that we need to do is to change people's perception of God. That is because there's an author named Robert Short who wrote a book called Something to Believe in. And among the many profound things he says in that book are that he says that people tend to resemble the gods they serve. And I think that is profound. People tend to resemble the gods they serve. And so it's very, very difficult to raise people's behavior above their perception of God. So what we need to do is to change people's perception of God from judgmental and cruel to that of loving. During the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln was sometimes criticized because he loved his enemies too much. He was told that you shouldn't love your enemies, you should seek to destroy them. To which Lincoln replied, "Do I not destroy my enemies when I make them my friends?" Isn't that powerful? Do I not destroy my enemies when I make them my friends? Abraham Lincoln was a universalist. He believed in the power of love and the preciousness of each individual, and because of that, he could love even his enemies. And what a difference that made in how he lived his life. It seems to me that we who believe in universalism are called to live the same way. We who believe in universalism, who believe in the power of love and the preciousness of each individual, are called to rise above being judgmental and cruel in order to be able to transform the world through love. So we who believe in universalism have a wonderful and a powerful message to share with the world, and it's really important that we do so. Once again, Robert Short, in his book, Something to Believe in, he says, "There is too much at stake for us to allow ourselves to be intimidated by the wrathful self-righteousness of the hell-raising gloomy doomies." Isn't that a mouthful? There is too much at stake for us to allow ourselves to be intimidated by the wrathful self-righteousness of the hell-raising gloomy doomies. Then he goes on to say, "Therefore our witness to them should be just as aggressive and unambiguous as theirs has been to us." Fundamentalists can be intimidating. They go around quoting the Bible and asking people whether or not they're saved. They exhibit such confidence, so they can be intimidating. But I'd say it's important that we not be intimidated by them. After all, we are the ones with the good news. They instead spread a teaching that is divisive and leads to cruel and inhumane behavior and justifies abuse. With their understanding of things, it is really no big deal to torture people, whether at Guantanamo Bay or whatever. After all, they believe that God is going to torture people forever because they were naughty. And if it's okay for God to torture people, surely it must be okay for us to do it. Besides the torture that we might inflict upon others, whether that's waterboarding or whatever, it's nothing compared to the torture that they say that God will inflict upon people forever in a literal lake of fire, no less. So we who believe in love, who believe in universalism, who believe in the preciousness of each individual, have truly good news to share with the world. So it's important that we not be intimidated by the hellraisers, by the people who advocate the teaching that a lot of people are going to suffer forever in hell. The teaching of a God of eternal damnation leads to wars and racism and oppression and abuse, while the spread of the teaching of universalism leads to equality, respect, love, and dignity for all. So I say, let's not be intimidated. Instead, let us freely and boldly proclaim to the world the wonderful message of universalism, and the world will be infinitely better off because of it. Amen.
Amen.
What lies ahead may feel unknown, but what we know is once we're grown, we hold the power within our hands to rise above and take a stand. We rise with boldness.
Thank you so much for that inspiring, provocative, important word. He mentioned that he's written a book. I'm going to give you an opportunity to learn more about that, and I hope to be able to offer you a link so that you can chase down that book for purchase. But first, come, join us in second hour today, 11:15 on Zoom. The link is on your screen. And let's talk more about this. Reverend Freestad has agreed to be with us for our second hour discussion, and I know that you are eager to hear more, as I am. For now, our service has ended. May our service begin.
Preach it all over this town, where you will land when you die. Some will go up and most will go down. So much for the sweet by and by. But I won't be taken by claims I'm forsaken, for sins too outrageous to mention. Not that I'm pure, but of this I am sure. Hell is a human invention. Hell is a human invention. Have you been sleepless with worry and fear, pondering brimstone and flames? Have you felt guilty without knowing why? Have you been laden with shame? Open your eyes and say your goodbyes to history's cruelest contention. Social control's not good for your soul, and hell is a human invention. Hell is a human invention. Hell no, there is no hell, except for the cruelty, the greed, and the fear we create for ourselves. And so we bid farewell to the myth that has served us so poorly that we must dispel. Hell no, there is no hell, except for the cruelty, the greed, and the fear we create for ourselves. And so we bid farewell to the myth that has served us so poorly that we must dispel. You hear them preach it all over the earth. Go now and preach what you know. Humans are beings of infinite worth. No torture is waiting below. Our work lies ahead, and it's not when we're dead. So cancel that misapprehension. And violence and war share wealth with the poor, and then you'll be sure love is creation's intention, and hell is a human invention.